When wrestling fans think of WCW's low points, the Dungeon of Doom is usually right up there. It was a baffling storyline with moments that were so insane they felt like a fever dream. And of course, Hulk Hogan was supposed to be the hero of the piece, but the fans just weren't buying it. But the question is, was it really that bad? By the early 90s, Hulk Hogan's position as wrestling's biggest hero was starting to slip. His star power was fading and fans were getting tired of Hulkamania. Behind the scenes, Hogan's relationship with Vince McMahon was becoming strained. The WWF was involved in a steroid scandal, and Hogan, with his 24-inch pythons, was attracting unwanted attention. And it seemed that Hogan was more interested in pursuing an acting career, although his starring role in the TV series Thunder in Paradise wasn't exactly setting Hollywood on fire. But while Hogan was stepping back from the WWF, WCW saw an opportunity. At the time, they were desperate to compete with the WWF, and executive producer Eric Bischoff believed that Hogan was the answer. Despite his falling popularity, Bischoff believed that Hogan still had enough star power to give WCW the edge. It was 1994 when Bischoff secured Hogan's services, and he pulled out all of the stops to make his debut feel like a massive event. Hogan went straight to the top of the promotion when he defeated Ric Flair for the World Heavyweight title in his first pay-per-view match with the company. But while Hogan's arrival brought a lot of attention to WCW, it also brought a ton of baggage. For the time, Hogan signed an absolutely massive contract. It was worth millions of dollars, and on top of that, he also had a creative control clause, meaning that he had the final say on his storylines and matches. He also insisted that a bunch of his longtime friends like Brutus Beefcake and John Tenta were also signed to lucrative contracts with the company, even though their best days were well and truly behind them back in the 80s. As WCW's booking began to lean heavily into the Hulkamania nostalgia, they revived the same old formula that had made Hogan a star a decade before. He was the unstoppable hero pitted against a bunch of cartoon villains. In the end, Hogan, representing good, always triumphed over evil, after a big boot and a leg drop of course. But it wasn't long before the fans were bored of Hogan's act once again, and the cheers were starting to be replaced by boos. Bischoff started to panic. Hogan was supposed to be his golden ticket in turning WCW around, and he wanted to justify his multi-million-dollar contract. So he turned to Kevin Sullivan for help. Kevin Sullivan had started his wrestling career in the 1970s, where he became known for portraying outlandish gimmicks. In the late 80s, Sullivan joined WCW, where he became a member of the booking team. Now in the 90s, he was given the job of restoring Hulk Hogan to his former glory, and so he created the Three Faces of Fear. In the storyline, Sullivan had a deep-rooted hatred for Hogan, and so he assembled a team of villains to destroy Hulkamania. Hogan's real-life friend, the former Brutus Beefcake, became the Butcher, and they were joined by Avalanche, who was previously known as Earthquake in the WWF. The Butcher was beaten by Hogan at Starrcade 1994 to retain the World Heavyweight title in one of the worst main events in WCW history. Then the group faced Hogan and Randy Savage in a tag match at the Clash of the Champions. Once again, Hogan emerged victorious, and the faction's days were numbered. The Three Faces of Fear was a total failure in its mission to reinvigorate Hogan's star power, but instead of trying something else, Sullivan decided to double down on the concept. The Dungeon of Doom was created. This saw Sullivan recast himself as the Taskmaster, the angry, face-painted leader of the group, and he assembled an army of bad guys to do the job. Avalanche was turned into the Shark, the Butcher became the Zodiac, and they were joined by Kamala the Ugandan Giant and Meng. For John Tenter, this was the worst gimmick of his entire career, where he was reduced to shouting "Shark Attack" while posing with his arm up like a shark's fin, and as far as Ed Leslie was concerned, he was decked out in black and white face paint and had no other personality beyond shouting yes and no repeatedly, which made him seem like some sort of malfunctioning robot. As far as Kamala was concerned, he was a familiar foe from Hogan's glory days in the WWF, although by 1995 his mystique had long since faded. And for Meng, it was just a real shame for him to be involved in this at all. He was an incredibly talented and genuinely tough man, but this just turned him into an absolute joke. And then there was Vader. He'd already been facing Hogan earlier in the year, but now he joined forces with the Dungeon of Doom 2. The idea was to position Vader as the faction's most credible threat, the one man with the size and power to end Hulkamania once and for all. Hogan beat Vader in a steel cage match at Bash at the Beach, and then Vader was supposed to turn face and side with Hogan, but he ended up getting fired after a backstage fight with Paul Orndorff. But there was another big man making his WCW debut in 1995, and that was the Giant. The man who would go on to become the Big Show was presented as the son of Andre the Giant, out to avenge his father's defeat at the hands of Hulk Hogan back in 1987. Andre vs Hogan was one of the most iconic rivalries in wrestling history, but the idea of Andre suddenly having a son who just happened to also be 7 foot tall and a wrestler was really dumb, and Paul White didn't look anything like Andre, apart from the height obviously, but apart from that ridiculous piece of storytelling, the Giant was actually really impressive. The man had an incredible mix of size and athleticism and charisma too. If you've only ever seen The Big Show later on in his career when he was a bit rubbish, then do yourself a favour and go back and watch his time in WCW. He was like a totally different man. By the Clash of the Champions 31, the Giant was firmly a part of the Dungeon of Doom. He was part of that infamous segment where Hogan wandered into the actual dungeon only to be ambushed. The Dungeon lads finally pushed things too far when they shaved Hogan's moustache off, which caused him to take a turn to the dark side. A week later, and Hogan came to the ring dressed all in black to show that he finally meant business. On paper, this could have been an interesting evolution for his character, a darker, meaner version of Hulk Hogan, but in practice it was little more than a wardrobe change. Sure, he told Mean Gene to shut up and acted a bit grumpier, but it was still the same old Hogan underneath. The nonsense hit its peak at Halloween Havoc, where Hogan and the Giant were set to face each other for the World Heavyweight title. But before the match, the men squared off in a sumo monster truck match on the roof of Detroit's Cobo Hall. If you're wondering what a sumo monster truck match involves, it's exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. 2 oversized monster trucks pushing against each other in a slow motion battle. Of course, Hogan won the contest, but then in a shocking moment, he pushed the Giant off the roof of the arena. Of course, in reality, it would have killed the man, but later in the show, he strolled to the ring for the main event without a scratch on him. And yet, for all the ridiculousness that surrounded him, the Giant was clearly the star of this entire thing. In fact, he was the only good thing about this whole mess of a storyline. They briefly made him World Heavyweight Champion, which shows the confidence that WCW had in him at the time, although Hogan made sure that the title changed hands on a DQ rather than him being pinned, naturally. But for every Giant success, there comes a Yeti-sized failure. The Yeti was a man wrapped in what appeared to be poorly applied toilet paper, resembling a mummy more than anything remotely Arctic. This creature was encased in a block of ice for his debut, and he was hyped as being an unstoppable force that would finally destroy Hulkamania. His in-ring debut saw him give a tag team bear hug to Hogan in one of the weirdest moments in wrestling of 1995. And then, just a couple of months later, came the least shocking twist imaginable. The Zodiac was revealed to have been a spy for Hulk Hogan all along. Yes, he'd been a double agent for this entire time. Somebody really should have thought about that before bringing him into the team, considering that he was one of Hogan's best mates. But as the Zodiac left the group, they introduced a bunch of new members like Loch Ness, Hugh Morris, Z-Gangster, and this guy. The Ultimate Solution was originally known as the Final Solution before someone explained to the idiots running WCW what that actually meant historically. Z-Gangster was the former Zeus from Hogan's No Holds Barred movie, and Loch Ness was the British wrestler formerly known as Giant Haystacks, and they took part in the Tower of Doom cage match at Uncensored. This was billed as the alliance to end Hulkamania, as the Dungeon of Doom joined forces with Ric Flair and Arn Anderson, forming an 8-on-2 team to take on Hogan and Randy Savage. And the match itself was hilariously bad. Hogan and Savage had to fight their way through each level of the cage, battling groups of opponents before descending down to the next one. It was so sad to see two guys as respected as Ric Flair and Arn Anderson involved in this absolute garbage. The Ultimate Solution and Z-Gangster were terrible wrestlers and added absolutely nothing positive to the match. The end of this over-the-top nonsense came when the former Zodiac ran in with some tiny frying pans for some reason. It was now March 1996, and even Kevin Sullivan had to admit that the Dungeon of Doom had failed in its mission to revive Hulkamania. Literally, the only good thing about this nonsense was the debut of the Giant, but everything else was trash. The antagonists had no real motivation that was ever explained. The characters were less than two-dimensional. The backstage stuff looked stupid and embarrassing, and not even the matches were any good. Nobody benefited from this, apart from all of Hogan's friends who got jobs in WCW despite being years past their prime. But luckily for everyone, the NWO was just a few months away. That would end up reviving Hogan's fortunes, and it finally gave WCW fans something worthwhile to tune in for.